I don't know. That sounds like a theological question. Whoa. Probably. It's music, right? You can do whatever you need with music. Well, you know, we didn't finish Mark last year, so I thought, you know, well, why don't we try to finish it this year? What do you think, right? And, well, Tammy made me make a list of all the times I'm going to be out this semester, which I thought was really good. She's playing ahead for me. Isn't that great? Yeah. Because I can't plan ahead for myself. It's true. Well, that's good. She likes my schedule. That's probably a good thing. So there's a list, and also if you'll put your name and email address, that way if for some reason I'm here, then I can warn you. I'm going to tell the church office so that you know in the bulletin, and you know they'll try to keep track of that. So anyway, we'll try to keep track. I'm not trying to tease you and then go away and then come back. You know, you're probably not come back. You'll be in an empty room, but. Maybe get together, discuss things, or go to the other classes. That's good too. In any case, you know, I'll try to keep you updated on my schedule and what I'm doing. I'm supposed to fly airplanes all over the world and then come back. So, come back part would be good. What I want to do today is not. I don't want to just launch. I mean, I guess we could just launch into where we were because we're in chapter 7 in Mark. But what I want to do is quickly give an overview of where we are. And you also have a piece of paper. I know I think you've all been in my class. You've all been in my class, I believe. But, you know, there's the notes. So you have a note page. And then there's the music. So it's too late for the music. You're past that point. But you have the notes and you have the other information there. There's also some past notes if you want to refill, keep track of things. Yeah, we are on session 30. If you miss one or you want to go back and review, you can go to YouTube. I'm recording these and I'll put them up on YouTube. That's a lot to go through, I know, but I figure that at least for prosperity, we'll keep some of this information together, and that's good. But the most important thing that we can get out of Mark is we can't look at Mark as if it is English literature, because it's not. It's Greek literature. It's ancient Greek literature, and therefore, what I do, if this is Greek to you, it's because it's Greek. You know that, right? So what I try to do is remind you all the time that we're looking at Greek literature. As a matter of fact, that's what we're doing. That's why it's taking us so long to get through Mark. Because every time we look at a verse, every time, and remember, there's no, verses were not originally in the Bible. Spaces, separation, go through the whole thing. But you know, every time we look at a phrase, a sentence in Greek, we find that new information, new ideas, new things that we may have never seen before. I see it all the time when I'm looking at it, and I want you to be able to see that too. So, as we go through, that's the most important thing to realize. This is Greek literature. And Greek literature is not like English literature, therefore we look for a logos to tell us. And so what I want to do is remind you of the overall logos to tell us. That's why I got it right here. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to look through, I'm going to just generally go through the logos to tell us for the overall book of Mark. And then we'll also remind ourselves of some other specific pertinent information. And finally, if we have time, we'll start back where we were in about 7:1. But as you know, I like to do the words of the day. And thanks, Judy. She gave me some more pens. But, you know, my old pens haven't worn out yet. And she's already got me a whole bunch, but she gave me some new colors. So this will be good. But we'll see if these work. Oh, let me get the blue one. The blue one. See if one of these blue ones work right. I need to throw away the old ones, the bad ones, right? I think this is the bad one. First of all, now this could be a C. It's just a trial to find the right ones. I need to throw away the old ones. That was bad. They're not very good. This one's good. Catamarchon. By Mark, or from Mark. So this is the title in Greek. If you wonder why that was up there, I think I told you a long time ago. And then these words of the day, the reason I picked these words of the day is to remind ourselves of how different Greek is. I know in English we have a bunch of words, well, our words for love. Generally we don't use a whole lot of different words for love. I mean, we have words that we can use, for example, lust and compassion and love, and there's usually we do have a lot of words for love if you look in your thesaurus, but we don't use many of them. What we usually do in English, what do we do in English when we want to explain the kind of love we're talking about?
Emphasis on it. The object of the love, this word.
Well, a lot of times we'll add, for example, love is a verb, so we add an adverb, or we have an adjective. For example, we say platonic love, or familial love, right? That's what we do in English. But Greeks don't. And this is true of all their language. This is true of all Greek language. Greeks like words to be very specific, and we know that. So Greek is an incredibly concrete language as opposed to English. So I'll just remind you, and I got phileo wrong, so I threw it up there, but A-G-A-P-A-N, agape. What we know as agape, and remember, what I'm doing is I'm pulling the words directly out of our concordance or our, if you're looking at the interlinear text, then what I'm doing is I'm generally pulling words that you'll recognize within the interlinear text. And so this is agape. Agape is a general form, just like the general form of most verbs in English is, like, for example, to run, right? We add to, the helper verb, to run. And then the forms are, ran, have run, right? Right. See? So in Greek, also words and verbs change in their formation. So that's what you'll read. And I'm not trying to teach you Greek grammar. I'm just trying to show you the words themselves in their forms. So if you're looking at your interlinear text, you'll see agapon is what you'll generally see. But this is what we call agape. That's the form. And so agape, what does agape mean? Now, I've given you definitions specifically from Strong's and Vine's. Usually I'll supplement that with Woodhouse. Woodhouse is the primary Greek dictionary, but it's kind of too complex to share with you because of the way it works. But Strong's and Vine's is the general one that's used from the biblical text, from the King James Version. And that's why I put it there for NAS and KJV. So NAS is a New American Standard, and then KJV. We use the NES. I use the NES usually, the New English. What's the one we use generally? NIV. New International Version. I've taught classes on what each type of translation is. I won't go into detail today. Sometime I might teach that class again. But in any case, agape, if you see, generally in Greek, especially ancient Greek in the period we're talking about, means the love of the gods. And if you note, I put in the notes, rarely used of men. Matter of fact, it is not used of men until later Greek. And this is something we need to know. Languages change. You realize that, right? Anybody remember reading Chaucer in the original? Remember that?
Try reading it.
Try reading Beowulf in the original. Beowulf is Anglo-Saxon, right?
Oh, yes.
And I've given you examples of Anglo-Saxon. You can't read it. Languages change. English language is not unique in changing from Anglo-Saxon to a mixture of Norman French and then into modern English. And in the Old English, medieval English, is almost inarticulate to us. Matter of fact, Shakespeare is sometimes inarticulate to us, right? But yet, you can dig through it. Languages change, and so when we talk about early Greek and early Greek civilization, generally, I'm not going to do a whole timeline of Greek history, but when we're talking about Greek literature, we're talking around 500 BC as a note, and then we're working in the period of about 0 BC. And actually, if you talk about Christ, about 6 BC at his birth until around grossly about 90 AD. So Greek language changed not super significantly, but reasonably significantly. And then there's a later period Greek. This is classical Greek. This is Koinean era. And we're usually looking at what's called Koinean Greek. It is the universal Greek of the period. Koinean Greek is not special Bible Greek. It is the universal Greek of the period. It is not a, I didn't mean to get into this much detail, but that's okay. Probably that's a good thing. Remember, Greece is city-states. And Greece is city-states in this period. And each city-state has their own dialect and language. Yes. And they use specific words. Athenian Greek is considered the classical Greek. That's Woodhouse Greek. Athenian Greek is what most Greek classical literature is written in Athenian Greek. That's considered classic Greek around the 500 BC era. And then what happened is that Athenian Greek became more and more universalized because of what happened? Because of who? Who did it? Alexander the Great conquered the world, which caused Greek and Hellenization to become the point of the world. And when that happened, they needed a Greek that was, and remember, Alexander the Great was what kind of Greek? He was from Macedonia. He was Macedonian, Macene, that's correct. And there's, well, you guys can remember, you probably remember half of them. Macedonia, Sparta, right? Athens. There's a whole bunch more. There's a bunches more of Greek city-states, and each of them with their own dialects. So when Alexander the Great took over the world, Alexander the Great, it's very interesting that the Greek that was chosen, and how it was chosen, who knows how it was chosen, but the Greek that became the Greek of Koinean world is mostly Athenian, very strongly Athenian. This is the classical Greek of the Greek world. Now, what really happened a lot is we know that pronunciations changed, but the meanings of the words did not change radically. Where we see a very strong radicalization and change in the Greek word verbiage was when, do you think? Post-classic, which led up to around 300 AD. What happened in 300 AD? What's the big deal about 300 AD, about that? Constantine. And what did Constantine do that threw Greek under the bus?
Christianized the world. I don't know.
But well, what did he do? What did he do specifically that threw Greek under the bus?
Constantine.
What language did old Constantine want documents in? Latin. And so Constantine basically had Bibles translated. Justinian translated the Bible into Latin. And I think it's the Douay. I think it's called the Douay. I have to go look at my notes. I didn't prepare for this specifically. I didn't prepare to give you a whole thing on the Greek language, but I think this is a nice time to look at it. But the point is that when Constantine had the Bible translated or used the biblical translation into Latin and put out, basically, there's so much that is beautiful in this because remember, I think he produced 50 Bible codexes. You know what a codex is, right? It's a book. The first books were invented so that the Bible could travel. And he put out 50 codexes that were Latin. And so the minute he did that, what was the world reading the Bible in? Greek. And really I shouldn't say Bible, I should say New Testament and Old Testament documents. They were the New Testament documents. And so when the New Testament documents came out in this form, that means that everyone was going into Latin. Greek's under the bus. No longer is Greek considered the primary language of the Bible. within that context. That doesn't mean that when the translators go back, that, you know, people have this false look or false idea that when you translate the text, people translated the Bible from Greek into Latin and then they translate into English or other languages. That's not the way it works. The translators have always gone back to the original source text of the Greek.
If they had it.
If they had it, this is true. And we see huge numbers of Latinizations in our texts, in our translations. You get, you know, we have seen personally how translations sometimes aren't very good, right?
Right.
Yes.
And the reason people say to me all the time, well, why don't these translations get fixed? Because the scholars know they're wrong. Why aren't they fixed? Well, the answer is because guess who first translated that way?
Scholars.
Justin Martyr, I think it's Justin Martyr, translated the Bible that way the first time, right? And so no one's willing to change it. And so we get Latinizations that come into the English text. And by the way, we like the Latinizations. Because remember, I can't ever let you forget this. Greek is a logos to a telos, where English and Latin are intro, body, and conclusion. And so we, as English speakers, want Latinization of our text. We love it. So we want all these little mistranslations because it makes us feel fulfilled. We don't like Greek. Because if you read the Greek, and we see it in Mark, Mark's a beautiful Greek text. In Mark all the time, does Jesus ever answer the question? No. Never.
No.
He never answers the question.
No.
He gives you a logos and he figures that you're going to figure out the telos. Because he's Greek. Right? He's a good Greek thinker. But we want, what do we want? We want a conclusion. We want an entelos in Greek. We want it to be thrown out. Give us the answer, please. Right? So, with this little information, what I want you to note is agape always in ancient and classical Greek and Koine Greek applied to the gods. No human being can agape.
Yes.
So what do the texts in the New Testament tell us that Jesus tells people to do and Paul tells people to do all the time? To agape.
Agape.
What does that mean it is?
Impossible godly
It is an
love.
impossible task. It's what's called, the Greeks call a paradox. Greeks love paradoxes. What do we think about paradoxes? No, we don't want to get close to a paradox, right? But the Greeks loved paradox. They thought it was the highest form of any way of thinking and being. When did Greek agape begin to apply, as I note here, to children, parents to children? And when did it start applying to people? Do you believe?
After the New Testament time?
After the New Testament era. Why? Because Jesus and Paul kept saying, agape, agape, agape. And guess what? When the Latin translated it, Latin is about as sparse as English in the words for love. As a matter of fact, Hebrew. How many words for love are there in Hebrew? 0. There is no word for love in Hebrew. I had to borrow some Aramaic words that mean, one means prostitution, one means incest, and another one is another illicit love. Because they had no words for love. There is no word for love in Hebrew at all. No concept in the culture. Not until the modern era. Greek love, you have the love of the gods. This is the love of the gods. That is, gods can have agape to man, and gods can have agape to each other. But man cannot have agape to the gods,
Until Christ.
nor can man have agape to people, to other people. You have this word, eros. Eros is one of the most misunderstood words in all of Greek, because eros means romantic love. It's romance. Now with the Greeks, their romance doesn't necessarily mean romance for a lady. All right? It doesn't mean that necessarily homosexuality either. But romance, when you read eros, it is not erotic, although that's where we get our word. It means romantic love. That is that kind of love. Now, when did eros, romantic love, really start coming out in Western culture as a concept, as applied to men and women?
Knights and ladies.
Knights and ladies. And that was caused by Christianity. Because Christianity began what we call the age of chivalry. In the age of chivalry, women were viewed with very high value. Women were not viewed with very high value in non-Christian cultures, ever. Probably the highest value of women in cultures is the ancient Egyptians and the Hebrews. Hebrews had some very strong legal things for women, and so did the ancient Egyptians. The Romans allowed women to own property. Actually, the Greeks allowed women to own certain types of property. Usually couldn't own land property. But in Egypt, women could own property, and in Hebrew, women could own property. And even they could hold lands, but they were held through an adjunct, usually through a male adjunct. So, very interesting that what we get with Christianity is that women become objects of love. And a lot of that is because of the call to agape. And Jesus said, what should men do for their wives? Love them.
Love them.
It never said that women should love their men, but it said men should love their women, which is really interesting. So guys, get on it, right? But eros is romance. Pathos. Pathos. This is what we would consider erotic or uncontrolled love. Right? We really don't have something that's equivalent to this. Pathos means uncontrolled emotion. And it applies to love. It specifically applies to love because in the Greek mind, when a person had sexual desire that they could not contain, that was pathos. And therefore, sexual activity, specifically in Greek, is pathos. There is another word for sexual, which is very pornographic. Well, in Greek, in the Greek world, it's pornographic. Paul actually uses it. I didn't put it up here, but in any case, when you talk about pathos, that means uncontrolled emotion, but specifically uncontrolled love. This is phileo. Phileo, Philadelphia, brotherly love. However, that is not a very good translation of phileo. Phileo means love between human beings. Generally in the Greek culture, because the Greeks were a Baita culture is a culture of warriors, where you have, what do you call them, shield warriors. Your shield warrior was your brother. And so therefore, you had phileo with your shield brother. This is why it's considered, quote, brotherly love, but it's really love between humans. The Greeks, and the Greeks had a very, remember, I told you already, women did not have a very high place in these ancient cultures. Men believed that women could not phileo. Period. In fact, I put this in one of my books. I love this. It's kind of a countercultural tribute. But, the guy is trying to convince an ancient Greek woman that, yes, I can phileo you, and you can phileo me. Because in Greek culture, women could not have phileo. It was thought that it was impossible for women to have that ability, to love that way. But phileo is more akin to what we would consider love of people. You love your, the Greeks would say you love your spouse, it's phileo, right? You love your, you can love any human being that you love, specifically within that context would be phileo. Epithumia. Epithumia. Epithumia is a beautiful word. It is usually translated lust, but it really means German Lust. Lust is more akin to desire. I desire something. But even then, Desire in English has a negative context, where Lust in Deutsch, in German, does not have a negative context. It just means I want something. Ich habe Lust. I desire it. I want it. It's a lot less strong. Epithumia literally means the scent of the sacrifice, the smell of the sacrifice. Because in ancient Greece, in the ancient world, and I'll always remind you this, because sacrifice is critical in our understanding of New Testament documents and Greek documents. Because sacrifice, you only got to eat meat if you were a Hebrew about 6 times a year. The 6 festivals. 3 pilgrim festivals and 3 other festivals. In Greece, you got to eat meat 12 times a year. Only 12 times a year. And the meat was always sacrificed. All meat was sacrificed in the ancient world, except under a very specific thing by the Hebrews. We might talk about it later, but in any case, so guess what you did when you smelled the meat cooking?
You salivated.
You salivated. You had desire. And so this word in Greek, epithumia, means, we translate it love or lust or desire. But it means the desire, okay, think about this. In the Greek mind, it means the desire for what?
Fed from the gods.
Well, but yeah, the gods. But what is, the gods, right? It is desire for what? Not just the meat. What does the meat in a sacrifice mean to you as a human being when you eat it? It means you are closer to
God.
the gods. So epithumia is a desire to be closer to the gods, right? It is a beautiful, powerful word in Greek. There's another word, meta-epithumia, which is even more powerful, but I won't get to that. That's okay. Anyway, S-T-E-R-G-E-T-H-R-O-N. Stergeon. Stergeon. Sterge. Sterge. Stergeon means parental love, or this is a love. The Greeks acknowledge that between married couples, remember, we're talking about a Greek culture, we're talking about Oriental culture. In Oriental culture, who got you married? How'd you get married?
Your parents arranged it.
Yeah, your parents arranged it. So you may have never known or met or whatever this person you're marrying, especially if you're middle class and upper class, the first time you met her, it's like, okay, you're walking down the aisle. Well, this is really special, right? So maybe there's some pathos. There can't be phileo, right? And you didn't have to do much romancing. But as you grow old together, you come to appreciate each other as human beings. And this in the Greek world was stergeon. Stergeon is sometimes described, I've heard it described as old shoe love. I don't like that. I think the Greeks had a higher point in this. The point was that, look, in the ancient world, okay, in our view of the world, which is a chivalric view that comes out of Western civilization, right, from a knight's kind of view, okay, how do we love? How do we love a woman? The guy in his knight costume goes riding his horse and wins her, right? Of course, nowadays they just have sex in bed a couple of times and then dump each other. But that's all right. That's modern culture. But the way it's supposed to be is the man is supposed to win the love of the woman, right? And by romance, right? By romantic gestures, not just saying, hey, you want to hop in bed and I have some condoms. Basically, by romantic gestures and kindness and love, you win the love of the person, right? And then you marry them. And then you have sex with them after you're married. That's kind of the way, that's Western civilization. So, in that view, we don't see necessarily a need for stergeon. But in the ancient world of the Greeks, where you met that person, you can't have phileo with a woman, right? And the first time you meet them, you don't have to romance them. It's kind of like modern college, except you leave, right, afterwards. But the big deal is that you would stay together because you were bound in marriage, and therefore you would come to love one another. So stergeon is a much more powerful, I think the old shoe, or it gives, the impression is that a lot of Christian people give, is that stergeon is a negative. But it's not. to the Greeks is a very positive thing. It shows and I'll give you an example. Have you ever read in the Greek myths, or for example, you may have even seen it in some of the Greek things because they experience it, how much did the women protect their men and their husbands in the Greek society? A lot, yeah. They were willing to die for them in some cases, right? And what did the men think about their women? They were... Yeah, they had an incredible duty to protect them. Matt, to the point of, remember, in a lawless culture, we want to think that everybody's hunky-dory and you got police down the road and, there's no police here. Might makes right in most of these cultures. So if you didn't have your women protected in a gynoecium and protected in their house with solid doors and dogs and guards, right, what could happen to them?
Get stolen or killed.
They could be kidnapped or, for ransom or killed or raped or, whatever. That's that kind of culture. And so the men would put up incredible amounts of effort in their culture to protect their women. And the women, we know, also protected their men. In the Greek myths, it's over and over and over again in the Greek myths, right? Of women protecting men and men protecting women. It's just a huge part of their cultural experience. And so that stergion is that idea, that concept. So maybe the first time they met was, in the marriage. But in the Greek culture, the strengthening of that bond of human beings was still there. In our culture, we believe, or we did believe in a time, that you would gain some of that love before.
Grown accustomed to the face.
Grown accustomed to your face, yes. And then the final word that I have here, although there are a few others, but I wanted to just remind you, mysterion. Mysterion. Because mysterion, and I'll discuss, we'll always get into mysterion, but you have to realize that the mysterion, and I won't go into great detail at this point, you guys know what I'm talking about, the mysterion being one of the most important features of both Greek religion and the religions of the time, can never be forgotten as one of the let's just say that every time we read something in Greek New Testament, we need to look at it within the context of Greek culture, Hebrew culture, and the mysterion. Because the mysterion is what is motivating a lot of times the questions. Matter of fact, today in the sermon, and if you haven't heard it yet, but the thing is about the Greeks coming to talk to Jesus. And you notice it kind of fades within the context, but it's a beautiful logos to tell us. But Jesus makes the comment, until a grain of wheat dies and falls into the earth. What was he talking about, guys? Yeah, but what? He's talking about Demeter. That is the Demeter, that is the, not a siren,
Not Demeter. Not Demeter.
Huh?
Demeter.
Demeter.
Not Dementor.
Dementor.
It's all different.
Oh, not Dementor like Harry Potter?
Yeah, not Harry Potter.
I thought it was
There we go.
Dementor. Anyway, Demeter. Well, I don't know, I may have in my notes because in Greek it is Dementor. But anyway, that's okay. Either way, because I think she borrowed the term. But anyway, that's all right. The point is this, the Minervan, is Minervan? Which Mysterion? Anyway, I think it's Minerva Mysterion. There's a Mysterion that was one of the most classic Mysterions at the time. And in that Mysterion, the mystery was for Demeter, though it was the goddess. She was the focus of that Mysterion. And one of the objects that they knew that, in classical times, you try to keep this secret. But, there's too many people that keep it secret. There were three things in the box. Three things that were the mystery. One was a seed, an ungerminated seed. The other one was a phallic symbol, and the other one was a sword. And you can get what they mean. It's obvious what they mean. Guess what? The sword represents death. The seed represents life and Demeter, basically the bread. And the phallic symbol represents reproductive activity. So when Jesus makes a comment about the seed to the Greeks, he's talking about this mysterion. And that's his point. He's communicating something to them that means almost nothing to us. Right? It means nothing to us. And when you hear him say it, you go, huh? Huh?
Well, I don't know if it meant nothing to us, because we interpret it to be him having to die on the cross first.
It is absolutely illogical. You know why? Does a seed die?
No.
No, a seed never dies. It represents life, and when you put it into the ground, it doesn't die. Right?
You hope.
It does. Well, you hope, right?
I had some bad experiences.
If it dies, it doesn't germinate, right?
Right.
So Jesus' statement within the context of science is a paradox. That paradox is resolved when you understand. And why did Jesus make it a paradox? What does it mean when a Greek writer or a Greek speaker gives you a paradox? What is he doing? You need to read more Greek literature. They're making a point about something else. That's right. So the point that he's making, look, okay, if the symbols of the Minervan, I think it's Minervan, it's not the Osirian, anyway, if the symbols of that mysterion are a seed, a sword representing death, and a phallic symbol, and Jesus wants to point you to it, what is he going to do if he's a Greek scholar? He's going to talk about death or sword. And by the way, the same word for sword can be death in Greek. We saw it before, right? So he's going to give you a sword or death. He's going to talk about a seed. He's going to talk about reproduction. What did he just do? I'm just saying, you know, we want to throw, well, we have thrown the Mysterion out for about 1,500 years or so by translating it as the Latin translated the Mysterion as secrets or mystery, which they aren't at all. The Mysterion is the silence in the initiation ceremony. That's what it means. But a Mysterion is a religion. So if you do not understand the point, then what will you think? You will get the wrong point. Right? The logos to telos is obvious. For example, Jesus makes the comment, and we'll see it in Mark later, but he says, if salt loses its savor, its flavor, can salt ever lose its flavor? Salt can never, ever, ever, from eternity, from the beginning of time to the end of time, salt cannot lose its flavor. Can't happen. What do? We make an English, see, this shows that we're not thinking right in Greek. When a paradox is thrown at you, as a scientist or a logistician or a Greek thinker, or even a Western civilization thinker, what should you do? Turn your brain on, right? What do?
Just absorb it.
Yeah. Well, my Sunday school teacher, when I was in 3rd grade, told me that, you know, Jesus said that if salt loses its savor, and guess what? You know, I guess salt can really lose its savor, right? No, it can't. Maybe we shouldn't be giving children these texts. Maybe we should be either explaining it better to them or not teaching them as stories. It's not stories. They're histories. And all the histories, they're logos that tell us Greek arguments. And maybe a lot of people aren't ready for the Greek arguments, you know what I'm saying? But we throw them out as if they're stories by this Jesus guy, right? This Jesus guy's a really smart guy. And unless we get it, we're not getting it. I think these are some beautiful things. And the words, you know, there are a few more Greek words for love. But the most important thing we need to note is just like when the Greeks speak, whenever we see the word love in English, because what we do in our translations is we translate all these words as love. But it makes a huge difference if we're talking about agape or eros or pathos or phileo or epithumia or stoicheia. You know, take your pick. Yes, sir.
Would eros, romantic love, be used in the Bible?
Yes, it is. Did I put it as an example? I didn't give you a verse. No, it's not. Eros is not in the Bible. That is correct. Eros is not. Merrick, the ones that I have given you some examples of translation, they are found in the Bible. But Sturgeon is not, and neither is Eros. Those are both not found. And, you know, you can think about this. This is really neat to think about. Why would the New Testament writers not write about Eros? It's just something to cogitate on. Interesting thought. Anyway,
Question here, Well,
what's that?
up in the dates, you said 300 AD was when the Latin Codex was written. When was the Greek New Testament? When was it written in Greek?
Well,
Compiled all the letters and everything?
That's a great, when was it put together?
Yeah.
The first time that we believe that it came together in a single source is in those codexes. Before that, and I don't think I've talked about this much before, but we do know that, and I've given you examples before when it's talked about Pauline letters. Generally, the New Testament documents were traveling around, and this is really neat stuff. They were traveling around the Gospels and Acts. Usually the Gospels are all found together in early sources. They're not found separately, generally. They're found all together in a codex or in a scroll. You find sometimes the Gospels in Acts. You find Acts and the letters. You find the Pauline letters many times, usually in early Greek together. And you find them, the other letters, the non-Pauline letters, in sometimes separately and sometimes together. But until Constantine, you didn't see them all together. But what's really interesting is Paul, if you remember how I've talked about Grammateus doing your writing for you, remember I told you that he would make a copy for it to be sent, right? That the messenger would take and read. He would make a copy for himself, and then he would make a copy for you. And Paul remarks multiple times about Timothy or others getting his papyron, his papyrus documents, his biblios, and getting his, what's the word for the skins? Yeah, what's the word for it? Parchments. Parchments, but there's another word in Greek.
Membranous?
Yeah, membranous. Exactly. Very good. Excellent. Hey, you got a star. Membranous, yeah. Membranous and papyrus, because the papyrus was probably what his letters were written on. And so his collection of letters, why we find the collection of Pauline letters together is likely because the churches didn't just, gather them together. But when Paul died, right, Timothy or his followers had his collection of letters all together in a single source. And so they were able to make copies of them. And that's why we find his letters usually in a codex all together. And then why the argument by some modern scholars is the reason that you find the Gospels together is because of the synoptic Q. Because Q is the supposed document that was the basis for Matthew, Mark, and Luke. That basically, somebody copied that and made it up, and there was a single source, whatever, Gnostic source, nah. Have you noted something? If you read, in the other classes, I know if you haven't been to all the classes, but in the other classes we noted, I've taught a class on Matthew. And if you read Matthew, go back and look at the notes in Matthew and look at the Greek. The Greek in Matthew is significantly different than the Greek in Mark, and I keep trying to point that out to you. But yet in English it's the same. So the people that were reading the Synoptic Gospels, supposed Synoptic Gospels in German, from Luther's translation, which is based in, guess what? The Latin. It's not translated from the Latin, it's based in the Latin original translation. It's translated from Greek. But the problem is, remember, Martin Luther didn't speak Greek. He didn't, so he couldn't translate himself. And the problem was that a lot of these translators were going from the Latin sources, because he did Latin. So the problem is, that what they did is this guy, Justin Martyr, was trying to make the Greek look like a Latin document, a Roman document. We want them to look like Roman documents. And guess what we want to see? We want them to be synoptic, right? But they're not synoptic. They may relate similar events, but the logos to telos is different, and that's the point. And that's a real quick thing I wanted to look at the logos to telos for Mark. So I gave you a outline, and the outline, the point is this, very simply. If you look at the beginning, the logos to telos, it builds an argument about what Mark is about. And the first whole point in that Mark, this is what I put you. In chapter 1, Jesus Christ, I'm going to have it marked here. Let's see, chapter 1. In the beginning, arche, the first and greatest gospel, euangelion, that according to Mark, this is the first gospel, euangelion, good message from the gods about Christos, the anointed Son of God. And this is what it is. It is written, it is kathos, written grapho, in Isaiah. Let's see, I'll skip this part. The voice disclosing from Isaiah, the voice shouting in the desert, in the lonesome place. Prepare the hodos for the Lord, for the Kyrios, Lord Mithras. Make straight, make a good place, the paths for him. And as I told you, I guess I won't pull it out of you, but the thing I want you to know, what is Mark's big deal? Din hodos. Din hodos means the way. Din hodos is what? It's what Christians call themselves. Who called them Christians? The Greeks called them Christians because they looked like a mysterion. They would never call themselves Christians. So Mark's whole treatise is about Din hodos, the way. That's what the primary point is in that first point, in the first thing there. And then in the chapters, the next chapters that we've been looking at is specifically his lordship and authority. And here I put it, I very generally put it when I did the outline, but authority over evil things and evil and sickness and cleanliness and sin and the Shabbat and the Torah and nature and death and Mishnah and the Gentiles. And there was more to that because remember the whole proof text and what we'll look at next time we meet together, because that's what we'll specifically get into. Meg, did I put it on the top? I think I did. No, I didn't put it on the top. But if you look at the bottom, Romans and the gods opposed. In other words, Jesus has lordship over the gods.
Over the gods.
The big claim, the primary claim by Mark is that this Jesus guy is what? He's God.
He
Yeah.
is God.
He is God. That is Mark's claim, that this guy is God. Now, if you're going to make a claim, that Mark makes his claim that Jesus is God, how are you going to back that up? What does he got to do?
Prove it.
He's got to prove it within the context of the culture. And so therefore, you know, I gave you this outline. The point is that, okay, what is his authority over evil beings and evil? What's an evil being in the Greek culture?
The demon.
Yeah, a demon, a god, exactly. What's evil within the Greek culture? That's an interesting question. I don't know if we'll answer it now. What is sickness in the Greek culture?
Curses, the work of the gods.
Yeah, exactly. You know, a fever is pure. In Greek, it's P-U-R, pure. In Greek, pi ellipson rho. In any case, in Greek, pure means to be cursed by Zeus. You have a fire within you that was cursed by Zeus. You have a fever. So every fever is a curse from the gods. Every sickness is a curse from the gods. everything that happened to you is a curse from the gods in Greek culture. And therefore, it's not sickness that Jesus has power over, it's the gods. If you look at, over sin, now the Greek idea of sin, maybe I'll talk about this in a second if we have time. Shabbat, now that's within a Jewish context. And by the way, let's think about this. In a Jewish context, where did sickness come from? What is sickness in a Jewish context?
Sin.
Well, they thought you had done something
Yeah.
wrong.
Punishment.
Job,
Consequence.
the whole thing.
The punishment from
God.
God. Which, by the way, is a Jobian view. It's not a Christian view. That's a Jobian view. The Jobian view of God is that God curses and God gives you goodness or blessings, right? That's not a Christian view. Not at all. But the big deal is that in a Jewish context, if you are misfigured, and the way that you could tell that someone was evil or sick or bad is they would be misfigured or ill or blind or deaf or dumb or leprosy, right? Things that you could see. Seizures, yeah, seizures. You've been cursed by the devil or demons, right? Maybe that's purely Greek idea. It's interesting. Because Hebrew doesn't talk much about it. But let me tell you something. Let's remember this context. This is a very important context for us. Remember, the Greeks like to get naked. They like getting naked and getting baths, right? What about the Hebrews? Oh, no. You...
Only during the mikvah.
Yeah, we were naked in the bath, but it's more private thing.
In the mikvah. Right. And maybe, before they had teruma, so at least the guys were getting a bath every 3 months, maybe, what? Or is that, they did every 2 months. You get a bath every 2 months or so, right? And sometimes they're not getting it all. The women get a bath every month, but they never took their clothes off. They're an Oriental culture that is very, they're like the Irish. According to the ancients, the best way to get rid of Irish fairies is take the clothes off because they can't stand the fact that people are naked. The Irish had this real thing about nudity. So did the Hebrews. And so in the Hebrew culture, you didn't take your clothes off. Tell me, riddle me this. What do you think all those Pharisees and Sadducees and the priests and the people look like under their clothes?
Don't even think about it.
Dirty,
Mice bitten.
sores, ringworm, all kinds of parasites, all fleas, you name it, right? How many pairs of clothes did they have? Maybe one if they're lucky, right? Because the Bible says you take the man's coat or cloak, right? Because he has one. See? You don't have 4 to have stuff. So the people that were ill or sick in the Jewish culture were ill or sick because you could see it. The people that were ill or sick and you couldn't see it is because they were clothed. So it was still there, right? I mean, there ain't people walking around in that culture that don't take baths except every 2 months, right? Can you imagine this culture? I don't think I want to be there, but it's okay, right? I think I'd rather be the Greeks. The Greeks, cleanliness is next to godliness. Seems like a Greek thing. It's not biblical, right? So think about this. Every time Jesus is talking to people, the people he's curing are people who have the appearance because it's on their faces. It's on their hands, right? The man with the withered. If the man had a withered thigh and just kind of clumped, you'd never know he had a withered thigh, but he had a withered hand, so it stuck out of his clothing. You see what I'm saying? So when Jesus makes these comments to the Pharisees and the Sadducees and to the other people about the fact that they are also cursed, they're also ill, they're also unclean, right? Very important to note this, because we don't get it. Of course, you're not going to show me that you have ringworm, but you're going to keep, you bathe at least a reasonable period of time, or, you're not going to be in a normal society, right? See? But the people in the past understood what was going on. We just don't. The Torah. The Lord of the Torah is important, and we're going to get into that next time we meet. The Lord over nature, remember? Oh,
Well, I was just gonna say, nature can be God's.
exactly.
Yeah.
That was my point. Remember, he stilled, he stilled the sea. And to us, the sea is the sea. But to the Greeks and to the Hebrews, the sea is Poseidon. Yeah, the gods.
Poseidon.
And when he stills the clouds, the storm, it's Zeus. See? We just want to, oh, it's a storm. It's a storm. It's like Dorothy and Toto, and the storm's coming across. But to the Greeks and the Hebrews, it's not a storm. And you can't forget that. Because if you forget that, you miss the whole point. Yeah.
Is Mark's audience both Greek and Hebrew?
I made the argument before, and I think this is really true. I think that Mark's audience is almost 100% Greek and Roman. And what we did when we first, the first verses that we looked at in Mark, I think really point to that. And by the way, as we go through it, because when we start back with chapter 7, there are lots of indications, like the words used. There's a lot of Latinized words that are used specifically by Mark that are not used in the other Gospels. There are specific, like for example, Matthew calls Jesus rabbi, right? But Mark never uses that term for Jesus. He always uses didaskalio. He uses the word teacher in Greek. So, the words that are used by the Gospels, we translate the word as teacher or rabbi or whatever, and everybody reads through them and they say, oh, it's the same, right? But Matthew looks like he's writing to a Jewish audience, where Mark looks like he's writing specifically to a Latin or Greek audience. So I would argue that 90% of the audience for Mark is Greek or Latin. And the reason I say Latin, because remember, the Latinization of the world really did not happen here. This is still the Hellenization of the world. The world had no reason to change from Greek, from Hellenization to Latin, until what happened? What's the most seminal event? I talked about it.
Constantine.
When Constantine produced the New Testament books in Latin, now it became more important to know Latin than it was to know Greek in the ancient world. So very important. Thank you, Father, for your word. We pray that you continue to look after us this time. We pray that you bring us all home safely and back here safely. In your name we pray, amen.